The mahogany doors of the courthouse felt heavier than they should have as I pushed them open that Tuesday morning. 23 years old, wearing a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit, clutching a manila envelope that contained documents I barely understood. The Whitmore family sat in the front row like they owned the place, which, according to them, they did. All of it. Every last brick, every acre, every dollar of the fortune that Harold Whitmore had spent 78 years building. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. They didn't even look at me when I walked in. To them, I was nobody, a mistake, an outsider who had no business being there. But that envelope in my hands was about to change everything. The story begins 3 months earlier, on a rainy October evening when the phone call came that would turn my world upside down. I was working the night shift at Morrison's Auto Parts, trying to make rent on my studio apartment in downtown Cleveland, when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. "Is this Marcus Chen?" The voice was crisp, professional, with the kind of authority that made you sit up straighter even when nobody was watching. "Yeah, that's me. Who's asking?" "This is Patricia Lawson from Lawson Burke & Associates. I'm calling regarding the estate of Harold Whitmore." "I understand you knew him personally?" Harold Whitmore. The name hit me like a punch to the chest. I hadn't heard it spoken aloud in over 5 years, not since the last time I'd seen the old man who had become the closest thing to family I'd ever known. Yes, I knew Harold. "Is he?" "Mr. Whitmore passed away last Tuesday. I'm sorry for your loss, Marcus. He spoke of you often." The wrench I'd been holding clattered to the concrete floor of the garage. Harold was gone. The man who had found me sleeping in his garden shed when I was 16, who had given me a job when no one else would, who had treated me like the grandson he never had. He was gone, and I hadn't even known he was sick. "The funeral is this Saturday," Patricia continued. "Mr. Whitmore specifically requested your presence. There are also some legal matters we need to discuss afterward." That Saturday, I stood at the back of St. Mary's Cathedral, watching hundreds of people pay their respects to Harold Whitmore. Politicians, business leaders, society figures, everyone who had mattered in Harold's world was there. The Whitmore family occupied the entire front section of the church. Victoria Whitmore, Harold's eldest daughter, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Her brother James stood stone-faced beside her, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his hands clasped behind his back like a soldier at attention. Their children, Harold's grandchildren, sat in a row, all of them looking appropriately solemn in their designer black clothes. I recognized most of them from the few times Harold had shown me family photos, always with a complicated expression on his face. "Blood doesn't make family, Marcus," he used to tell me during our Sunday morning walks around his estate. "Loyalty does. Love does. Blood is just biology." At the time, I thought he was being philosophical. I never imagined he was trying to tell me something important. After the service, Patricia Lawson approached me in the parking lot. She was a woman in her 50s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that seemed to see everything. "Marcus, we need to talk. Can you come to my office Monday morning?" "Is this about Harold leaving me something? Because honestly, I don't need anything. He already gave me more than I could ever repay." Patricia's expression was unreadable. "Just be there Monday morning, 9 o'clock sharp. And Marcus? Bring identification. Birth certificate if you have it." That Monday morning, I sat in Patricia's law office, surrounded by leather-bound books and certificates on the wall that spoke of decades of legal expertise. She placed a thick document in front of me, the kind of legal paperwork that makes your head spin just looking at it. "Marcus, what I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to process," she began, her fingers steepled in front of her. "Harold Whitmore has left you something in his will, something significant." I shifted uncomfortably in the leather chair. "Look, Mrs. Lawson, I appreciate whatever Harold wanted to give me, but I don't want to cause problems with his family. They're his real family. I was just—" "What were you, Marcus?" The question caught me off guard. I was just someone he helped out, someone he was kind to when I had nowhere else to go. Patricia leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Tell me about your mother, Marcus. Tell me about Rebecca Chen." The mention of my mother's name sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't talked about Rebecca Chen in years, hadn't even thought about her much since she died when I was 15. What does my mother have to do with anything? Your mother worked for Harold Whitmore 30 years ago. Did you know that? I shook my head. My mother had never talked much about her work, just that she cleaned houses for wealthy families to make ends meet after my father left when I was 5. Patricia pulled out another folder, this one thick, with yellow documents and photographs. Rebecca Chen worked as Harold Whitmore's personal assistant from 1985 to 1995. She wasn't just his employee, Marcus. She was much more than that. She slid a photograph across the desk. It was old, slightly faded, but clear enough to make my breath catch. My mother, looking young and beautiful, standing next to Harold Whitmore outside what I now recognized as the Whitmore estate. They weren't posing formally like employer and employees. Harold's arm was around her waist, and they were both laughing at something off camera. They looked happy. They looked like they belonged together. Your mother and Harold had a relationship that lasted nearly 10 years, Patricia continued quietly. It was complicated. Harold was married, though he and his wife had been estranged for years. When your mother became pregnant in 1992, Harold wanted to leave his wife and marry her. The room felt like it was spinning. That's impossible. My father, his name is on my birth certificate. David Chen married your mother when you were 3 years old and legally adopted you. But he's not your biological father, Marcus. Harold Whitmore is. I stared at the photograph, seeing details I hadn't noticed before. Harold's eyes, the same dark brown as mine. The shape of his nose, which I'd always thought came from my mother's side. The way he held his left shoulder slightly higher than his right, a habit I'd developed without knowing why. My mother never said anything, never even hinted. Rebecca made Harold promise to stay away from both of you. She didn't want you growing up in the shadow of a scandal, didn't want you to be seen as illegitimate. Harold honored that promise, even though it broke his heart. When your mother died, and you ended up in foster care, Harold tried to find you, but you'd already aged out of the system. I remembered those years, 16 and homeless, bouncing between shelters and sleeping rough, doing whatever I could to survive. Until that night when I'd broken into Harold's garden shed, desperate for somewhere warm to sleep, and instead of calling the police, he'd brought me a sandwich and a thermos of hot coffee. He knew who I was, I whispered. When he found me in his shed, he knew. Patricia nodded. He'd been looking for you for months. When you showed up on his property, he saw it as providence. But he was afraid that if he told you the truth, you'd think he was trying to buy your affection, or that you'd reject him completely. So he decided to let you get to know him first, to build a relationship based on who you both were as people. He was going to tell me eventually? He wrote you letters, Marcus. Dozens of them. He never sent them, but he wrote them. They're all here. She gestured to another box on her desk. He was waiting for the right moment, but that moment never came. I felt like I was drowning in revelations. So what does this mean? What did he leave me? Patricia's expression grew serious. Harold Whitmore has left you his entire estate, Marcus. The house, the businesses, the investments. Everything. You are now worth approximately $47 million. The number hung in the air like something impossible. $47 million. More money than I could comprehend, more than I'd ever dreamed of having. But his family, Victoria and James, they're his children too. Actually, no, they're not. Patricia pulled out another document. Victoria and James Whitmore are Harold's stepchildren. When Harold married Eleanor Whitmore in 1970, she was a widow with 2 young children. Harold adopted them and gave them his name, but they were never his biological children. You, Marcus, are Harold's only biological heir. The weight of it all crashed down on me at once. I wasn't just inheriting money. I was inheriting a legacy, a name, a family history that I'd never known belonged to me. And somewhere across town, the people who had thought of themselves as Harold's family were about to learn that everything they'd believed about their inheritance was wrong. There's one more thing, Patricia said, her voice gentle but firm. The Whitmore family is going to contest this will. They've already contacted their lawyers. They're gonna claim that Harold wasn't of sound mind when he made these changes, that you somehow manipulated him. This is gonna be a fight, Marcus. Are you prepared for that? A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. I looked at the photograph of my mother and Harold again, at the happiness in their faces, at the love that was so obvious now that I knew to look for it. Then I thought about all those Sunday mornings walking with Harold, all the times he'd ask me about my dreams, my hopes, my plans for the future. He hadn't just been making conversation. He'd been getting to know his son. Yeah, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. I'm prepared. The war began the next morning with a phone call that woke me at 6 a.m. The voice on the other end was cold, clipped, and unmistakably hostile. This is Victoria Whitmore. I believe we need to talk. I sat up in my narrow bed, still processing everything Patricia had told me the day before. Mrs. Whitmore, Meet me at Riverside Cafe on Oak Street in 1 hour. Come alone. The line went dead before I could respond. Riverside Cafe was the kind of upscale establishment where a cup of coffee cost more than I usually spent on lunch. Victoria Whitmore sat at a corner table, her back perfectly straight, her blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon. She was wearing a navy blue suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and her manicured fingers drummed impatiently on the white tablecloth. She didn't stand when I approached, didn't offer her hand, didn't even look up from her phone until I cleared my throat. You're smaller than I expected, she said finally, her ice blue eyes scanning me from head to toe with undisguised disdain. Harold always described you as if you were some kind of impressive young man. I see now that his judgment was compromised. I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, fighting the urge to leave. Mrs. Whitmore, I think there's been some misunderstanding. Oh, there's been a misunderstanding, all right, but not on my part. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. I don't know what kind of game you played with my father, what sob story you fed him, or how you manipulated a sick old man into changing his will, but I'm going to expose you for exactly what you are. Harold wasn't sick when I knew him, and I never asked him for anything. Victoria's laugh was sharp and bitter. Of course you didn't ask. That would have been too obvious. No, you were much cleverer than that. You played the long game, didn't you? The poor orphan boy, so grateful for Harold's kindness, so humble and respectful. You made him feel like a hero, like he was saving you. The waiter approached our table, but Victoria waved him away with an irritated gesture. James wanted to handle this differently, she continued, but I thought you deserved to hear this directly from me. We know exactly what you are, Marcus Chen. You're a con artist, a very patient, very calculating con artist who saw an opportunity and took it. I felt my temper rising but forced myself to stay calm. If that's what you believe, then why are we having this conversation? Why not just let your lawyers handle it? Because I want to give you one chance to do the right thing, walk away. Renounce your claim to Harold's estate, and we'll make sure you're compensated for your services over the years. $100,000. More money than someone like you has ever seen. Someone like me? Don't play dumb. We've done our research, Marcus. We know about your background. Foster care, juvenile detention, sleeping in parks. You're street trash who got lucky enough to charm an old man who was losing his mind. The words hit like physical blows, but I kept my voice steady. Harold's mind was sharp as a razor until the day he died, and I was never in juvenile detention. Victoria pulled out a manila folder and slid it across the table. Really? Then explain this. Inside were photocopies of police reports, arrest records, court documents. My hands shook as I flipped through them. Shoplifting when I was 17. Trespassing. Loitering. All the stupid, desperate things I'd done when I was hungry and homeless and had nowhere else to turn. Harold knew about all of this, I said quietly. I told him everything. Of course you did. It was part of your act. The reformed bad boy, so grateful for a second chance. It's a classic manipulation tactic. I closed the folder and slid it back to her. You can believe whatever you want about me, Mrs. Whitmore. But Harold knew who I was, and he made his decision based on the truth. Victoria's composure cracked for just a moment, and I saw something raw and desperate in her eyes. Harold Whitmore was my father in every way that mattered. He raised me, he loved me, he gave me his name and his protection when my real father died. James and I built our lives around being Whitmores. Our children carry that name. And now you think you can just show up and take it all away? For the first time since this conversation started, I felt something other than anger toward her. I understood what she was feeling because I'd felt it myself, the terror of losing the only family you'd ever known. I'm not trying to take anything away from you, I said. I didn't even know Harold was my father until yesterday. Convenient timing. Mrs. Whitmore, I grew up thinking my father was a man named David Chen who walked out on us when I was 5. I had no idea about any connection to Harold until Patricia Lawson told me. If I was running some kind of con, don't you think I would have played that card years ago? Victoria stared at me for a long moment, then shook her head. It doesn't matter what I believe. What matters is what we can prove in court. And we can prove that you had access to Harold for years, that you knew he was wealthy and vulnerable, and that you systematically isolated him from his real family. I never isolated him from anyone. Harold talked about you and James all the time. When was the last time you saw us at family gatherings? When was the last time Harold spent Christmas with us instead of with you? The question caught me off guard because I realized she was right. For the past 3 years, Harold had spent every major holiday with me. He'd told me it was because he didn't want me to be alone, but now I wondered if there had been more to it. Harold made his own choices about how to spend his time, I said finally. Did he? Or did you make sure he felt guilty every time he chose us over you? Victoria leaned back in her chair, her confidence returning. Here's what's going to happen, Marcus. We're going to contest this will, and we're going to win. We have documentation of Harold's declining mental state in his final months. We have witnesses who will testify that he was confused, paranoid, easily influenced. We have proof of your criminal background and your financial desperation. She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table. That's my lawyer, Richard Blackwood. He's never lost an estate case. He's going to tear you apart in court, expose every lie you've ever told, every crime you've ever committed. By the time he's done with you, you'll be lucky if you don't end up in prison. Quote, I looked at the business card, expensive cardstock, embossed lettering, the kind that announced serious money and serious connections. But it doesn't have to come to that, Victoria continued, her voice softening into what might have been sympathy if I didn't know better. Take the 100,000, Marcus. It's more than fair. It's more than generous. Walk away now, while you still can, and we'll make sure this whole ugly business stays private. I thought about my studio apartment with its leaking faucet and broken heater. I thought about my job at Morrison's Auto Parts, about the constant stress of wondering if I'd make rent each month. $100,000 would change my life. It would give me security I'd never known. But then I thought about Harold, about the man who had found me at my lowest point and treated me like I mattered. I thought about all those Sunday walks, all the conversations about integrity and standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. No, I said, standing up from the table, I won't take your money and I won't walk away. Victoria's mask of civility finally slipped completely. Then you're an even bigger fool than I thought. We're going to destroy you, Marcus Chen. We're going to take everything Harold left you, and we're going to make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person you really are. Maybe. But at least I'll know I stood up for Harold's wishes, even if no one else will. I turned to leave, but Victoria's voice stopped me. One more thing, Marcus. Since you seem to think Harold cared so much about you, you should know that he came to see me 2 weeks before he died. He was having second thoughts about changing his will. He said he was worried he was being unfair to James and me, that maybe blood wasn't as important as the family that had been loyal to him for 40 years. The words hit me like a physical blow, but I didn't turn around. If that's true, then why didn't he change it back? Because he died before he could. But I think that tells us something about his real intentions, don't you? I walked out of the cafe without another word, but Victoria's final revelation echoed in my mind. Had Harold really been having second thoughts? Had he died uncertain about what he'd done? The possibility that I was fighting for something Harold himself had doubts about made my stomach turn. By the time I got home, there were 3 messages waiting on my answering machine. The first was from Patricia Lawson, asking me to call her immediately. The second was from a reporter at the Cleveland Herald, who somehow already knew about the will and wanted a statement. The third was a hang-up, but I could hear classical music playing in the background before the line went dead. I called Patricia back, and her voice was tense when she answered. "Marcus, we need to meet. Now." The Whitmores have already filed their contest, and they're not playing games. They've hired Richard Blackwood, and he's requesting an emergency hearing to freeze all assets pending investigation. What does that mean? It means you can't touch a penny of Harold's money until this is resolved. It also means they're going to try to prove Harold was mentally incompetent when he made the will. Do you have any idea what evidence they might have? I thought about Victoria's confidence, about her certainty that they could prove Harold's declining mental state. No, but they seem pretty sure they can make their case. Then we need to make ours stronger. I'm going to need you to document every interaction you had with Harold over the past few years. Every conversation, every activity, everything that might demonstrate he was lucid and making rational decisions. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment trying to remember details that had seemed insignificant at the time but might now determine my future. Harold discusses stock market trends with the sharpness of someone half his age. Harold remembered obscure details about conversations we'd had months earlier. Harold makes complex decisions about his business investments right up until the end. But I also remembered moments that might be interpreted differently. Harold sometimes forgot where he'd put his reading glasses. Harold occasionally repeated stories he'd told me before. Harold seemed confused about what day it was when I called him early in the morning. Were those signs of normal aging or evidence of mental decline? And if Harold had really been having second thoughts about the will, what did that say about his true intentions? The phone rang again, jarring me from my thoughts. This time it was a number I didn't recognize. "Marcus Chen? This is Detective Sarah Morrison with Cleveland PD. We need to talk." Detective Sarah Morrison was nothing like I'd expected. She was young, maybe 35, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and sharp green eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of my cramped studio apartment as she stepped inside. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, gesturing toward my second-hand couch. "Do I have a choice?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "There's always a choice, Mr. Chen. That's what I'm here to talk about." I remained standing, arms crossed, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "What does Cleveland PD want with me?" "We received a complaint yesterday. Someone alleges that you may have engaged in elder abuse, specifically financial exploitation of Harold Whitmore." She pulled out a small notebook and flipped it open. "The complainant claims you isolated Mr. Whitmore from his family, manipulated him into changing his will, and possibly coerced him into making financial decisions while he was mentally compromised." My blood ran cold. "That's not true, any of it. I'm sure you understand why we have to investigate. $47 million is a lot of money. People have done terrible things for much less." Detective Morrison's eyes never left my face as she spoke, watching for tells, for signs of guilt or deception. I'd seen that look before, years ago when I was living on the streets, and cops would roust me from doorways and park benches. "Harold Whitmore was like a father to me," I said carefully. "I would never have hurt him." "Like a father, that's interesting phrasing." She made a note in her book. "Tell me about your relationship with Mr. Whitmore. How did you meet?" I told her the story. Breaking into Harold's garden shed, his unexpected kindness, the job he'd given me, the years of Sunday walks and quiet conversations. Detective Morrison listened without interruption, occasionally jotting down notes. "And during all this time, he never mentioned that he was your biological father?" "Not once. I only found out after he died." "That must have come as quite a shock." "The biggest shock of my life." Detective Morrison leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Chen, I'm going to be direct with you. The Whitmore family has provided us with some concerning information. They claim that in the months before his death, Harold Whitmore exhibited signs of confusion, memory loss, and paranoid behavior. They say he became increasingly dependent on you for basic decisions and that you encouraged this dependency." "That's a lie." Quote, "They also provided us with documentation showing that you have a criminal record, theft, trespassing, Various misdemeanor charges from your teenage years. I felt the familiar shame creeping up my neck. I was homeless and hungry. I did what I had to do to survive. Harold knew about all of that. Did he know that you were arrested for fraud when you were 19? The question hit me like a physical blow. What are you talking about? Detective Morrison consulted her notebook. Marcus Chen, age 19, arrested for attempting to cash a forged check at First National Bank. Charges were eventually dropped due to insufficient evidence, but the arrest is still on record. My mind raced back to that time in my life, the desperate months after aging out of foster care, sleeping in homeless shelters, taking any work I could find. And then I remembered. That wasn't fraud, I said slowly. I was working for a temp agency, cleaning offices at night. My supervisor gave me a check to deposit for petty cash expenses, but when I tried to cash it, the bank said it was forged. Turned out the supervisor was running some kind of scam and using temp workers as unknowing accomplices. Can you prove that? It was 7 years ago. The temp agency went out of business. The supervisor disappeared. I ran my hands through my hair, feeling trapped. Look, detective, I understand why this looks suspicious. Poor kid with a criminal background suddenly inherits millions from a wealthy old man. But I swear to you, I never manipulated Harold. I never even knew he had money when we first met. But you knew eventually. Of course I knew. It was hard to miss when I was working on his estate, when he drove luxury cars and wore $1,000 watches. But I never asked him for anything. Not once. Detective Morrison made another note. The Whitmores claim that you systematically isolated Harold from his family, that you encouraged him to spend holidays with you instead of them, that you spoke negatively about his children, that you made him feel guilty for spending time with anyone else. I thought about Victoria's accusations, about how Harold had indeed spent recent holidays with me rather than his family. But the truth was more complicated than either side wanted to admit. Harold told me he felt like a stranger in his own family, I said finally. He said Victoria and James only called when they needed money, that his grandchildren barely acknowledged his existence except at Christmas and birthdays. He felt like he was just a bank account to them. And you comforted him in his loneliness. I listened to him. I spent time with him. I treated him like he mattered. The words came out more defensively than I'd intended. Detective Morrison studied me for a long moment. Mr. Chen, I'm going to give you some advice. If there's anything you're not telling me about your relationship with Harold Whitmore, now would be the time to share it. Because if this goes to trial and new information comes out that makes you look deceptive, it's going to hurt your case significantly. I met her gaze steadily. I've told you the truth, detective, all of it. She closed her notebook and stood up. We'll be conducting a thorough investigation. We'll be interviewing Harold's doctors, his household staff, his business associates. We'll be examining his financial records for any unusual transactions in the months before his death. If you're innocent, you have nothing to worry about. After she left, I sat alone in my apartment, feeling the walls closing in around me. The Whitmores weren't just contesting the will. They were trying to have me arrested. They were painting me as a criminal, a manipulator, someone who had taken advantage of a vulnerable old man. The phone rang again. This time it was a number I recognized, Patricia Lawson. Marcus, we have a problem. I just got off the phone with Richard Blackwood. The Whitmores have filed for an emergency hearing to have you removed as executor of the estate. They're claiming you're under criminal investigation and therefore unfit to handle Harold's affairs. Can they do that? If the judge agrees that you pose a risk to the estate's assets, yes, the hearing is tomorrow morning at 9. Tomorrow? That's barely 12 hours' notice. Emergency hearings don't follow normal procedural timelines. Marcus, I need you to understand the seriousness of this situation. If we lose tomorrow, not only will you be removed as executor, but it will severely damage our chances when the contest goes to trial. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about Harold, about all the conversations we'd had over the years. Had I somehow influenced him without realizing it? Had my presence in his life driven a wedge between him and his family? Was Victoria right that Harold had been having second thoughts about the will? I remembered one conversation in particular, from about 6 months before Harold died. We'd been walking through his garden, and he'd seemed unusually contemplative. "Marcus," he'd said, stopping beside a rose bush he'd planted in memory of my mother, "what do you think makes a family?" "I don't know. Love, I guess. Loyalty. Being there for each other. Not blood." "Blood helps, but it's not everything. Look at you and Victoria and James. You raised them like they were your own." Harold nodded slowly. "Sometimes I wonder if I did right by them. I gave them my name, my money, my protection, but I never gave them the one thing they really needed." "What's that?" "My heart, my whole heart. There was always a part of me that belonged to someone else. At the time, I'd assumed he was talking about my mother. Now I wondered if he'd been talking about me, the son he'd found too late to raise properly, but not too late to love." The next morning, I stood outside the courthouse in the same ill-fitting suit I'd worn to Harold's funeral. Patricia met me on the steps, her expression grim. "I won't lie to you, Marcus, this is going to be difficult. Blackwood is one of the best litigators in the state, and he's had weeks to prepare while we've had hours." Inside the courtroom, the Whitmore family sat in the front row like a unified front. Victoria wore black, as if she were still in mourning. James sat beside her, his jaw set in determination. Behind them, I recognized several people from Harold's funeral. Business associates, family friends, people whose influence and testimony could sway a judge. On our side of the courtroom, there was just Patricia and me. Richard Blackwood was exactly what I'd expected. Silver-haired, expensive suit, the kind of confidence that came from decades of winning cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch. When he stood to address the judge, he commanded the room with his presence alone. "Your Honor, we are here today because an injustice of monumental proportions is about to be perpetrated upon the Whitmore family. Harold Whitmore spent his final years under the influence of a young man with a documented history of criminal behavior, a young man who systematically isolated him from his family and manipulated him into making decisions that betrayed 40 years of love and loyalty." He gestured toward me with barely concealed disgust. "Marcus Chen is currently under investigation by the Cleveland Police Department for elder abuse and financial exploitation. He has a criminal record dating back to his teenage years. And yet, according to a will that was mysteriously changed just months before Harold Whitmore's death, this individual is set to inherit an estate worth nearly $50 million. Blackwood paused, letting his words sink in. "Your Honor, we ask that you remove Marcus Chen as executor of this estate immediately, before he can do any more damage to Harold Whitmore's legacy." Patricia stood to respond, but I could see from her posture that she was fighting an uphill battle. "Your Honor, my client is innocent of any wrongdoing. The police investigation is preliminary, based entirely on allegations made by the same family members who stand to benefit if Marcus Chen is removed from the will. As for his criminal record, these were minor offenses committed by a homeless teenager trying to survive on the streets. Harold Whitmore knew about these incidents and chose to see past them to the man Marcus had become." Judge Margaret Thornton, a stern-looking woman in her 60s, listened to both sides with the impassive expression of someone who had heard every possible variation of human greed and desperation. "Mr. Blackwood, do you have evidence that Mr. Chen has mishandled estate assets since becoming executor?" "Your Honor, Mr. Chen only became executor 3 days ago. But we have substantial evidence that he manipulated Harold Whitmore over a period of years, isolating him from his family and exploiting his emotional vulnerabilities." "That's a serious accusation. What evidence do you have?" Blackwood smiled. "We have testimony from multiple witnesses, Your Honor, people who knew Harold Whitmore well, and who observed disturbing changes in his behavior after Marcus Chen entered his life." He called his first witness, Dr. Elizabeth Harper, Harold's personal physician for over 20 years. She was an elderly woman with kind eyes and a gentle manner, the sort of doctor who inspired instant trust. "Dr. Harper," Blackwood began, "in your professional opinion, how was Harold Whitmore's mental state in the months before his death?" Dr. Harper glanced at me with what might have been sympathy. Harold was experiencing some cognitive decline, nothing dramatic but noticeable changes. He had trouble remembering appointments, occasionally seemed confused about dates and times. He asked me several times about medications he'd been taking for years, as if he'd forgotten their purpose. In your medical opinion, would these symptoms affect his ability to make complex financial decisions? Potentially, yes. Harold was still functional in most areas of his life, but his judgment may have been impaired, particularly regarding relationships and emotional decisions. My heart sank as I listened to Dr. Harper's testimony. Everything she was saying was technically true. Harold had shown signs of aging, moments of confusion that I'd dismissed as normal for someone in his 70s. But hearing it presented as evidence of mental incompetence felt like a betrayal of the sharp, thoughtful man I'd known. Blackwood called 2 more witnesses, Harold's housekeeper, Mrs. Valdez, who testified that Harold had become increasingly secretive in his final months, often taking phone calls in private and seeming agitated after visits from that young man. And then Thomas Whitmore, James's eldest son, who described his grandfather as becoming, quote, paranoid and suspicious of family members, constantly asking whether people were visiting him out of love or for money. Each piece of testimony felt like another nail in my coffin. By the time Patricia stood to cross-examine the witnesses, the damage felt irreversible. But Patricia was more skilled than I'd given her credit for. She methodically dismantled each witness's testimony, revealing inconsistencies and alternative explanations for Harold's behavior. Dr. Harper, you mentioned that Harold seemed confused about his medications. Isn't it true that he'd recently switched to a new pharmacy and was adjusting to different pill containers and labeling systems? Well, yes, but... And these episodes of confusion you described, did they occur during your routine office visits, or were they reported to you by family members? Dr. Harper hesitated. Most were reported by family members. Patricia moved on to Mrs. Valdez. You said Harold became secretive about phone calls. But isn't it true that Harold had always conducted his business calls in private, and that these agitated states you observed often occurred after he'd been arguing with his children about their spending habits? By the time Patricia finished her cross-examinations, she'd created reasonable doubt about the witnesses' interpretations of Harold's behavior. But I could see from Judge Thornton's expression that we were still losing. Then Patricia called her own witness, someone I hadn't expected to see. I call Michael Brennan to the stand. Michael Brennan was Harold's longtime business partner, a man in his 60s with the kind of sharp intelligence that came from decades of successful investments. He walked to the witness stand with the confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to and believed. Mr. Brennan, Patricia began, how long did you know Harold Whitmore? 35 years. We were business partners and close friends. Did you have occasion to interact with Harold in the months before his death? Yes. We spoke almost daily about business matters. We had lunch together twice a week right up until the week before he died. In your opinion, how was Harold's mental state during this period? Brennan's answer would determine everything. Michael Brennan adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Judge Thornton with the steady gaze of a man who had spent decades making million-dollar decisions based on careful analysis. Harold's mind was as sharp as it had ever been, he said firmly. In fact, in the weeks before his death, he made some of the most astute investment decisions I'd seen from him in years. He restructured his portfolio, sold off underperforming assets, and moved money into emerging markets that have since proven to be extremely profitable. I felt a surge of hope, but Brennan wasn't finished. More importantly, Harold talked to me extensively about his estate planning. He wasn't confused or manipulated. He was deliberate, thoughtful, and completely aware of the implications of his decisions. Patricia stepped closer to the witness stand. Did Harold discuss Marcus Chen with you? Frequently. Harold had been searching for his son for years. When Marcus appeared at his estate, Harold saw it as the answer to a prayer he'd been afraid to voice. Did Harold express any doubts about his decision to leave his estate to Marcus? Brennan paused, and I felt my stomach drop. This was the moment Victoria had been referring to, Harold's supposed second thoughts about the will. Harold struggled with the decision, Brennan said carefully. Not because he doubted Marcus's worthiness, but because he felt guilty about Victoria and James. He'd raised them as his own children, and he knew this would hurt them deeply. But did he consider changing the will back? He asked me what I thought he should do. I told him that blood is blood, but family is what you make it. Harold had to decide what kind of legacy he wanted to leave. one based on legal obligations or one based on love. Richard Blackwood rose for cross-examination, his confidence intact despite Brennan's testimony. Mr. Brennan, you mentioned that Harold felt guilty about his decision. Doesn't that suggest he knew he was making a mistake? No. It suggests he was a good man who didn't want to hurt people he cared about. But Harold also knew that Victoria and James had trust funds worth millions each, properties in their names, and successful careers he'd helped finance. Marcus had nothing. You're asking this court to believe that Harold Whitmore, a man who had loved and raised Victoria and James for 40 years, decided to abandon them for a stranger he'd known for less than a decade? Brennan's voice hardened. Marcus wasn't a stranger, he was Harold's son. And Harold didn't abandon anyone. He made sure Victoria and James were financially secure long before he changed his will. After Brennan stepped down, Judge Thornton called a brief recess. Patricia and I huddled in the hallway outside the courtroom. How do you think we're doing? I asked. Better than I expected, but it's still close. Brennan's testimony was crucial, but Blackwood scored points with the guilt angle. Judges don't like family drama, and this case has more drama than a soap opera. When court resumed, Blackwood called one final witness, someone whose appearance made my blood run cold. I called Dr. Kevin Morrison to the stand. Dr. Morrison was a psychiatrist in his 50s, with the kind of authoritative presence that came from years of expert testimony. I recognized his name from Victoria's research file. He was the doctor who had evaluated Harold's mental state at the request of the Whitmore family. Dr. Morrison, Blackwood began, did you have occasion to evaluate Harold Whitmore? Yes. The family contacted me 6 weeks before Mr. Whitmore's death, expressing concerns about his mental state and his relationship with a young man who seemed to have undue influence over him. And what did your evaluation reveal? Mr. Whitmore was experiencing what we call late-onset vulnerability to emotional manipulation. While his cognitive functions were largely intact, he showed signs of increased emotional dependence and decreased ability to recognize exploitative behavior. The testimony felt like a punch to the gut. Dr. Morrison had never even met me, but he was describing my relationship with Harold as inherently exploitative. In your professional opinion, was Harold Whitmore capable of making rational decisions about his estate in his final months? In my opinion, Mr. Whitmore's emotional state made him susceptible to influence from anyone who provided him with affection and attention. His decisions regarding his estate were likely compromised by this vulnerability. Patricia's cross-examination was aggressive. Dr. Morrison, how many times did you actually meet with Harold Whitmore? 3 sessions over 2 weeks. 6 hours total to evaluate a man you'd never met before? That's sufficient time for a preliminary assessment. Did you interview Marcus Chen as part of this evaluation? No. Did you observe Mr. Chen and Harold Whitmore interact? No. So your opinion about their relationship is based entirely on secondhand reports from family members who stood to inherit millions if your assessment supported their position. Dr. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. I based my evaluation on established psychological principles and Mr. Whitmore's self-reported experiences. What did Harold himself tell you about Marcus Chen? He described a young man who had become very important to him, someone he felt protective of and responsible for. Did he describe feeling manipulated or exploited? Not in those words, no. Did he express any desire to change his will? Dr. Morrison hesitated. He mentioned feeling conflicted about his estate planning. Conflicting is not the same as being manipulated, is it, doctor? No, but... In fact, isn't it normal for people to feel conflicted about difficult family decisions? Yes. And isn't it possible that Harold Whitmore's, quote, emotional vulnerability was simply grief over losing the love of his life 24 years ago and joy at finally finding his biological son? That's one interpretation. By the time Dr. Morrison stepped down, Patricia had effectively dismantled his credibility, but the damage was done. The courtroom was full of testimony about Harold's supposed mental decline, my criminal past, and the suspicious timing of the will change. Judge Thornton deliberated for less than 20 minutes before returning with her decision. This is a complex case involving serious allegations and substantial assets. While I find no evidence that Mr. Rizak, Chen has mishandled estate funds or committed any crimes as executor. The pending police investigation and the substantial questions raised about the circumstances surrounding the will change give me cause for concern. My heart sank. However, I'm not convinced that removing Mr. Chen as executor would serve the estate's best interests. Instead, I'm appointing a neutral third party, attorney Robert Walsh, as interim co-executor. Mr. Walsh will oversee all major financial decisions until the contest is resolved. It was a compromise that satisfied no one. The Whitmores looked furious that I hadn't been removed entirely. I felt like I'd lost something important, even though I was still technically in the game. As we filed out of the courtroom, Victoria Whitmore approached me in the hallway. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "That was just round one." "I know. You have no idea what you're up against, Marcus. We have resources you can't imagine. We have connections, influence, money to fight this for years if necessary." I looked at this woman who had raised herself as Harold's daughter, who had lived her entire adult life believing she was his heir, and I felt something unexpected: pity. "Mrs. Whitmore, I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't know Harold was my father. I didn't manipulate him or scheme to get his money. If you want to hate someone, hate him for keeping secrets from all of us." For a moment, her mask slipped, and I saw the scared little girl underneath. "He was supposed to be my father," she whispered. "He walked me down the aisle at my wedding. He held my children when they were born. How can 40 years of love mean less than a biological connection he ignored for most of your life? Maybe it doesn't have to mean less. Maybe Harold left room for all of us in his legacy." Victoria's expression hardened again. "There's no room for compromise, Marcus. Either you're family or you're not. And you're not." That evening, I met Patricia at her office to discuss strategy for the main trial. Robert Walsh, the court-appointed co-executor, was there too. A thin, serious man in his 40s who spoke in the precise language of someone who had spent his career cleaning up other people's messes. "The good news," Patricia said, "is that we survived the emergency hearing. You're still in position to inherit if we win the will contest." "What's the bad news?" "The bad news is that today was easy compared to what's coming. Blackwood is going to use the next few weeks to dig up every piece of dirt he can find about you, your relationship with Harold, and anything else that might cast doubt on the will's validity." Walsh leaned forward. "I've reviewed the estate's financial records, and there are some irregularities that concern me. Large cash withdrawals in Harold's final months, changes to investment strategies, some unusual gifts to charities you recommended, Marcus." "What kind of irregularities?" $50,000 in cash withdrawals over 3 months. No clear documentation of where the money went. And Harold donated $100,000 to the homeless shelter where you volunteered, right after you mentioned their funding problems." I felt sick. Harold asked me about the shelter because he wanted to help. I never asked him to donate anything. "I believe you," Walsh said, "but it's going to look suspicious to a jury." Patricia was already taking notes. "We need to document every transaction, every conversation, every decision. If Harold had legitimate reasons for these financial moves, we need to prove it." "There's something else," Walsh continued. "I found a safe deposit box registered to Harold that wasn't mentioned in his estate planning documents. I'll need your permission to open it." "Of course. What do you think is in it?" Given Harold's penchant for secrets, it could be anything. More documentation about your mother, additional evidence about his relationship with the Whitmore family, or something that completely changes our understanding of his intentions. Over the next week, I tried to return to some semblance of normal life, but it was impossible. Reporters had discovered my address and camped outside my apartment building. My boss at Morrison's Auto Parts told me to take an extended leave rather than deal with the media attention. Even buying groceries became an ordeal. The strangest part was the mail. Letters arrived daily from people I'd never met, some supportive, others hostile, most asking for money. Apparently, the story of the poor foster kid who inherited millions had captured public attention in ways I never expected. One letter stood out from the rest. It was handwritten on expensive stationery, with no return address. "Marcus," it read, "Harold told me about you years before he died. He carried a picture of you in his wallet and talked about you constantly. He was proud of the man you'd become and frustrated that he couldn't be a real father to you. Whatever his family says about his mental state, I can tell you that Harold knew exactly what he was doing when he changed his will. He wanted you to have the life he couldn't give your mother. Fight for it. A friend. The letter was unsigned, but it gave me something I'd been lacking. Confirmation that Harold's decision had been deliberate and thought out, not the product of manipulation or mental decline. 3 days later, Patricia called with news about the safe deposit box. "We opened it this morning," she said, her voice tight with excitement. "Marcus, you need to get down here immediately. What we found changes everything." Patricia's office felt different when I arrived that afternoon. There was an energy in the air, a sense that something fundamental had shifted. Walsh was there, along with 2 people I didn't recognize, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and a younger man with the bearing of someone accustomed to handling sensitive information. "Marcus," Patricia said, "I'd like you to meet Elena Rodriguez, Harold's former secretary, and David Kim, a private investigator Harold hired 6 months before his death." Elena stepped forward first, her eyes kind but serious. "Mr. Chen, I worked for Harold for 15 years. I knew about you long before you knew about him." "What do you mean?" She gestured to the conference table, where dozens of documents were spread out like pieces of a puzzle. "Harold hired investigators to find you when you turned 18. He'd been searching for you since your mother died. When you showed up at his estate that night, it wasn't a coincidence. He'd been hoping you'd come to him eventually." David Kim opened a thick folder. "Harold knew the Whitmore family would contest any will that favored you over them. So he spent months documenting his mental state, his reasons for changing the will, and evidence of his family's true relationship with him." Patricia handed me a leather-bound journal. This was in the safe deposit box. Harold wrote in it almost daily for the last year of his life. I opened the journal with trembling hands. Harold's familiar handwriting covered the pages, neat and precise, with dates marking each entry. March 15th, had lunch with Victoria today. She spent the entire time complaining about her credit card bills and asking when I planned to increase her trust fund payments. Never once asked about my health or my day. I realized afterward that I can't remember the last time she visited without wanting money. April 2nd, Marcus helped me plant roses in Rebecca's garden today. He worked for 3 hours without complaint, refusing payment as always. When I told him stories about his mother, he listened with such hunger. This boy has never known what it feels like to be truly loved. April 20th, James called to check in, which meant asking if I'd consider investing in another one of his failing business ventures. When I suggested he focus on making his current company profitable, he accused me of being unsupportive. The conversation ended with him hanging up on me. May 1st, took Marcus to see the lawyer today about setting up a college fund for him. He protested, saying he didn't deserve charity. I wanted to tell him the truth then, but I'm still afraid. What if he rejects me? What if he thinks I'm just another rich old man trying to buy affection? Page after page revealed Harold's growing certainty about his decision, his frustration with Victoria and James, and his deep love for the son he'd found too late. July 10th. Dr. Morrison came by at Victoria's request. She's worried about my mental state, which apparently means she's worried I might change my will. The irony is that I'm thinking more clearly now than I have in years. For the first time, I know exactly what I want my legacy to be. August 3rd. Told Marcus about his mother today. Not the whole truth, but enough. Showed him pictures of Rebecca. He cried, and so did I. This boy carries so much pain, but he's never let it make him bitter. He's everything I hoped he would be. September 15th. Made the final changes to the will today. Patricia tried to convince me to tell Marcus the truth first, but I want him to love me for who I am, not what I can give him. If he finds out after I'm gone, at least he'll know that every decision I made was based on love, not guilt or obligation. Elena pointed to another document. This is a psychological evaluation Harold commissioned on himself. He wanted proof that he was mentally competent when he made his final decisions. The evaluation, conducted by Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation, painted a picture of a man in full command of his faculties, grieving the lost years with his son but determined to make amends in the only way he could. David Kim spread out a series of photographs. Harold also had me document his interactions with the Whitmore family over the past year. These photos were taken during family gatherings, business meetings, and private conversations. The images told a stark story. Victoria and James at family dinners, both on their phones, ignoring Harold completely. James visiting Harold's office with business proposals, his body language aggressive and demanding. Victoria's children at Christmas, playing with expensive gifts while Harold sat alone in the corner. But there were also photos of Harold and me, walking in his garden, working on household projects, sitting on his porch talking. In every image, we looked like what we were, family. "There's more," Patricia said, handing me another folder. Harold documented every financial request the Whitmore family made over the past 5 years. Victoria asked for money 17 times, for vacations, shopping sprees, her daughter's private school tuition. James requested business investments totaling over $2 million, most of which failed. Meanwhile, Elena added, "You never asked Harold for anything, not once. I handled all his personal correspondence, and there's not a single record of you requesting money, gifts, or favors." The evidence was overwhelming, but David Kim had saved the most damaging revelation for last. "Harold hired me to investigate something else," he said quietly. He suspected that Victoria and James had been trying to have him declared mentally incompetent for months before his death. They'd consulted with lawyers about challenging his mental state, hired Dr. Morrison to evaluate him, and even discussed having him committed to a care facility where they could control his finances. Patricia leaned forward. In other words, they were planning to contest his mental competency long before they knew about the will change. This wasn't about protecting Harold. It was about protecting their inheritance. The trial began 2 weeks later. The courthouse was packed with reporters, curiosity seekers, and supporters from both sides. The Whitmore family arrived in matching black suits, projecting an image of respectability and grief. I wore the same borrowed suit, feeling like I was playing a role I didn't understand. Richard Blackwood's opening statement was masterful. He painted Harold as a vulnerable old man, preyed upon by a cunning young criminal who had exploited his loneliness and grief. He described me as a master manipulator who had systematically isolated Harold from his real family and poisoned his mind against the children who had loved him for 40 years. Patricia's response was simpler but more powerful. She held up Harold's journal and spoke directly to the jury. Harold Whitmore was not a victim. He was a father who found his lost son and chose to leave him the legacy that should have been his from the beginning. Every word in this journal, every document we'll present, every witness we'll call, will prove that Harold made his decision with a clear mind and a full heart. The trial lasted 6 days. Blackwood presented his witnesses with skill and precision. Doctors who testified about age-related cognitive decline, family friends who described Harold's changed behavior, financial experts who questioned the timing of the will change. But Patricia's evidence was devastating. Harold's journal entries were read aloud, revealing his true feelings about his family and his joy at finding me. The photographs David Kim had taken showed the stark difference between Harold's relationships with the Whitmores and with me. The psychological evaluation proved Harold's mental competency beyond any reasonable doubt. The most damaging moment came when Patricia called Dr. Morrison back to the stand and revealed that he'd been paid by the Whitmore family not just to evaluate Harold, but to provide an opinion that would support their planned competency challenge. "Dr. Morrison, isn't it true that you were hired specifically to find evidence of mental decline, regardless of Harold's actual mental state?" I was asked to provide an honest evaluation? An honest evaluation that would support a predetermined conclusion? I resent the implication. Doctor, we have emails between you and Victoria Whitmore discussing the need to establish, quote, clear evidence of diminished capacity. Were you providing medical opinions or legal ammunition? By the time Dr. Morrison left the stand, his credibility was in ruins. The final blow came when Patricia called Victoria Whitmore herself to testify. Under oath, Victoria was forced to admit that she'd begun consulting lawyers about challenging Harold's competency months before his death, that she'd hired investigators to find damaging information about me, and that she'd attempted to restrict Harold's access to his own financial accounts. Mrs. Whitmore, You testified earlier that you were motivated by love and concern for Harold, but isn't it true that your primary concern was protecting your inheritance? Victoria's composure finally cracked. He was supposed to be my father. We built our lives around being Whitmores. How is it fair that some stranger gets everything just because of biology? So you believe Harold was wrong to leave his estate to his biological son? I believe Harold was sick and confused and manipulated by someone who saw an opportunity. Even though Harold's own words, written in his private journal, say otherwise? Victoria had no answer. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood with the verdict in his hand. In the matter of the estate of Harold Whitmore, we find that the will dated September 20th is valid and reflects the true intentions of the deceased. We find no evidence of undue influence, mental incompetency, or fraud. The courtroom erupted. Victoria Whitmore sobbed openly while James sat in stunned silence. Reporters rushed toward me with microphones and cameras, but I barely heard their questions. I had won. Harold's final wishes would be honored. I was now one of the wealthiest young men in Cleveland, inheritor of a fortune beyond my wildest dreams. But as I stood in that courthouse, watching the family that had raised Harold walk away in defeat and humiliation, victory felt hollow. This wasn't the ending Harold would have wanted. He'd loved Victoria and James. Despite everything, he'd wanted to provide for me without destroying them. That evening, I called Patricia with a decision that surprised even me. I want to set up trust funds for Victoria and James, and college funds for their children, not because I have to, but because Harold would have wanted me to. Marcus, you don't owe them anything. They tried to destroy you. They tried to protect what they thought was theirs. I understand that now. 6 months later, I stood in Harold's garden, watching the roses bloom that he'd planted in my mother's memory. The Whitmore family had quietly accepted the trust funds I'd established, though we'd never spoken directly since the trial. Detective Morrison had closed her investigation after finding no evidence of criminal behavior. The media attention had died down, leaving me to figure out what to do with a fortune I'd never asked for. I'd quit my job at Morrison's Auto Parts, not because I had to, but because I'd found something more meaningful to do with my time. I was working with homeless shelters, funding programs for kids aging out of foster care, investing in organizations that helped people like I'd once been. Harold's letters to me, the ones he'd never sent, sat on my desk in his study, now my study. In them, he'd shared his hopes for my future, his regrets about the past, and his dreams of the relationship we might have had if circumstances had been different. The last letter, written just days before his death, ended with words I read every morning. Marcus, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you've learned the truth about who you are. You are my son, not because of blood, but because of the man you've chosen to become. You owe me nothing, but I hope you'll consider one request. Use what I've given you to build the kind of family we never got to have. Love without condition. Forgive without reservation. And never let money matter more than what's in your heart. The fortune is yours, but the legacy is up to you. Standing in that garden, surrounded by the scent of roses and the weight of inheritance, I finally understood what Harold had been trying to tell me all along. Family wasn't about blood or wills or courtroom battles. It was about choice. The choice to love, to forgive, to build something better than what came before. I was Harold Whitmore's son, and I was going to make him proud. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.